Continuing now in Chapter 9 of Price Analysis, a fundamental approach to the study of commodity prices, we're going to take a look at the third and final use category, and that is the feed and residual category. Now recall when we learned about the basics of balance sheets and when we learned about the WASD report, we already know that the feed and residual category is actually a derived category, and that means that the USDA does not go out and survey people in the market to get an estimate of how much use is going into livestock feed and such. They literally just take all of the supply categories and they subtract off both of the other use categories and subtract off their estimate of ending stocks, and that's what they get for their estimate of the feed and residual category. And I've expressed this here in the form of an equation. So production imports beginning stocks, that's the total supply, minus ending stocks, and minus the food, seed, and industrial category. So this category is the most difficult to forecast, mostly because that since it's a derived category, any of the other categories that are estimated with error get impounded into this estimate. So if we have an error in our estimate of production because maybe the USDA was off on their acres estimate, for example, or if they had higher error in the food, seed, and industrial category, both of those errors will get impounded in the feed, seed, and the feed and residual category, and that makes it kind of difficult to forecast. However, this category does exhibit a very high degree of seasonality, and that's largely because of what it mainly is. So we talked about how the errors get impounded into this category, but primarily at a base level, the corn that's in this category is the corn that's being fed to livestock. This category has a seasonal pattern primarily because of the way beef cattle ranching works. Beef cattle spend most of the summer out on pasture eating grass and not eating things like hay and grain. But at the end of the summer, they come home from grass and they start being put out to winter pasture. And the calves that are with the mother cows, they start to be fattened for slaughter. And primarily after the harvest of the new corn crop comes in, when grain is at seasonally low prices, that's a good time to ramp up your feeding of your beef cows. So we see highest levels of this feed category in the second quarter of the year, beginning in December. And so this would be, if we examine this peak, for example, this would be the summer quarter before the quarter that starts in December. And then this fourth one down here would be summer again, when most of the herd is out to pasture, eating grass, and not eating hay or grain. If we take a look at this category in levels annually, we can smooth out a lot of that seasonality that we saw in the quarterly graph. And if we take a look at the trend over time, we see that this category in levels is fairly flat. Now if we take a look at the charts in levels on the top here in Figure 8 and compare that to the percent of production chart in Figure 9, the trend looks very similar to what we saw in the export category. And that is, levels are keeping pace and holding steady, so we're feeding about as much grain to livestock as we have been in recent history. But as we've increased production, the share going into animal feed has been decreasing over time. So to summarize what we've seen in these three categories, we've seen an increasing share going to the production of ethanol of the corn crop, and decreasing shares coming from the export category and from the feed and residual use category. Let's talk now about price sensitivity in these different use categories. Just by examining the figures above, you can get a sense that the least price sensitive category is the food, seed, and industrial category, and this is the category that includes ethanol production. And since ethanol consumption is mandated by the RFS, the demand for corn going into ethanol production is fairly inelastic. The next category in terms of sensitivity to prices is the feed and residual category. And this is partly because the American diet is fairly robust to variations in price. People do make slight modifications to their grocery list in response to how expensive different meat products like beef, poultry, and pork are, but really it's variation around a largely constant trend. That leaves us with the final category being exports as the most price-sensitive category, which we discussed a little bit earlier. So we saw particularly in figures 5 and 6 that when we had the severe drought in 2012, that produced a period of high prices, and we saw exports reduced very dramatically. And that illustrates how much this category is sensitive to prices. When other countries are faced with high U.S. prices, then they can readily, if they can readily substitute cheaper grain from other countries, then they'll do so. So that's why we see this category being the most price sensitive of all the use categories. Now, as we transition from thinking about price sensitivity in these use categories to trying to forecast the use categories, you should probably be able to guess that we will need to pay the most attention to trying to forecast the most price-sensitive category. Because a category not being price-sensitive means whether prices are high or prices are low, the use in that category will be fairly close to whatever the trendline use is, and therefore making it easier to forecast. So when you listen to people talking about trying to forecast use in the balance sheet, a lot of effort is given to trying to forecast the exports category. So let's talk about how we might go about trying to forecast the export category. The way people typically do it is during the marketing year, they keep track of how many exports have been sold so far. And then you can look back at recent history and say, okay, are we on pace to meet the USDA's forecasted use for this category? If export sales are going much slower than usual, then we might expect that the USDA is going to have to revise down that export number. If the pace of export sales is going much faster than usual, then we might expect that the USDA will have to bump up the export sale number. So people look to the USDA's reporting system for exports to get a sense of how fast export sales are going. The USDA has not one but two different agencies that are involved with estimating the export sales in the country. And we have two of them because they kind of serve different functions, but they both, through those functions, end up producing decent estimates about what our export numbers are. So let's talk about each of them in turn. The first we'll talk about is the export sales reporting system of the USDA's Foreign Agricultural Service. This system was created in response to a very specific event in history. In 1972, the Soviet Union purchased huge amounts of wheat and corn that depleted the U.S. reserve stocks and caused a sizable increase in food prices. Also, after this event came to light, it was a publicly held concern that large grain handling companies might have access to market-sensitive information specifically related to sizable quantities of exports, and they might be able to trade in a way that was specifically advantageous to them personally, and maybe not so much to the public at large. So before the program was established, it was hard for the public to get information on export quantities until the product had actually left the port. And this program helps make sure that every market participant and every broad member of the public has information about the size of exports at the same time. So the export sales reporting system requires both daily and weekly reports to be made. A daily report only needs to be made in the case of a large export sale. And a large sale is defined as 100,000 metric tons in one day to a single destination, or 200,000 tons or more of a commodity from multiple destinations. And in the event that an export sale was reported, you'll see those come out in the morning the next day. And oftentimes when you listen to market commentators on the Market Open, they'll talk about if there was a large export sale reported or not. Now, all of those export sales, whether they were large or small, get added up and released in a weekly report, and those come out every Thursday. The other entity is the Grain Inspection Packers and Stockyards Administration that was created in 1994, and basically they are in charge of inspection at all of our export ports, and they're to make sure that all of the locations are maintaining uniform U.S. standards in terms of weights and measures, and that all of those entities are acting fairly. As a byproduct of that activity, they also produce useful statistics about export shipments, and they make those available monthly. So you might imagine that this could create some conflict between the Foreign Agricultural Services export reporting system and the GIPSA's export reports. And so they have a memorandum of understanding with one another that they will get together periodically and make sure that their estimates match, so that the USDA doesn't have these two reports that generate wildly conflicting information being disseminated into the market. That does it for Chapter 9. In this week's exercises, we're going to take a look at how exactly we might keep track of exports from a pace of use perspective. So we'll go out and look at the export sales reporting system of the Foreign Agricultural Service, and we will just put ourselves in the shoes of a person who needs to make forecasts about what marketing year exports will look like, and we'll kind of review the methodology that's typically used to keep track of that.